In certain moments of spiritual breakthrough, your simple decision to stop pretending triggers a complete motivational collapse that terrifies everyone around you. There was no dramatic breakdown, no spiritual crisis announcement. You simply chose authenticity over performance, and suddenly you can't force yourself to care about anything that once drove you. This complete motivational shutdown has an explanation, and it is not spiritual bypassing. It is psychological reconstruction. If you have ever been accused of becoming lazy or lost after your awakening for simply refusing to maintain energetic investments that no longer serve your authentic self, this video is your mirror. What's really happening operates at a level most spiritual content never explores. The neurobiological rewiring of your entire motivational operating system through what Carl Jung called the transcendent function, combined with what modern researchers identify as post-conventional moral development collapse. Donald Winnicott identified a pattern that explains why this feels so terrifying to others around you. He called it the collapse of the false self-structure. When your authentic self finally emerges, the elaborate performance system you've maintained to keep others comfortable simply stops functioning. The people who benefited from your false self experience this as abandonment, but you experience it as finally being able to breathe. Peter Fonagy's groundbreaking work on mentalization reveals why this process feels so isolating. Your capacity for reflective functioning, understanding the mental states behind behavior, has dramatically increased. But most people around you are still operating from pre-reflective patterns. You can see the unconscious motivations driving their actions, but they can't see yours because authentic motivation looks like doing nothing to minds still trapped in performance-based reality. Number 1, the hidden mechanism, transcendent function activation. Here's what's really happening at the unconscious level during your motivational collapse. Jung's transcendent function has activated. This is the psychological mechanism most people never learn about. It's your psyche's natural ability to bridge conscious and unconscious content to create entirely new ways of being. Klein's framework reveals the deeper process. What appears as lost motivation is actually your psyche refusing to reenact splitting mechanisms. For years, you motivated yourself through internal division, good self versus bad self, spiritual self versus material self, acceptable desires versus shadow desires. Your awakening dissolved these artificial splits, and suddenly the motivational engine that ran on internal conflict simply stops working. This is why you feel a strange emptiness where drive used to be. You are not becoming lazy. You are experiencing what researchers call motivational system integration. Your psyche is refusing to generate energy for anything that requires you to fragment yourself again. There's a neurobiological reason this feels so extreme. When authentic integration occurs, your brain literally rewires its reward pathways. The dopamine responses that once activated from external validation, achievement, or social approval begin shutting down as your nervous system recalibrates to recognize only authentic satisfaction signals. But this mechanism becomes more complex when we consider the developmental origins of your previous motivational patterns. Number 2. The developmental origin, false self-collapse. Winnicott's framework illuminates exactly why this feels like death. Your motivational system was built on what he called compliance with environmental demand. From early childhood, you learned to generate energy for activities that made others comfortable, that fit social expectations, that maintained relational harmony. This wasn't conscious manipulation, it was adaptive survival. Your spiritual awakening triggered what Winnicott termed good enough mothering recognition. You finally realized that most of your environment was not, in fact, good enough to hold your authentic self. The motivation you thought was yours was actually borrowed from other people's needs, other people's projections, other people's comfort requirements. If you've ever felt like you're performing a version of yourself that everyone expects but no one actually sees, you understand this developmental blueprint. Your awakening dissolved the performance, but it also dissolved the motivational fuel that performance provided. You're not losing motivation. You're discovering that most of what you called your motivation was never actually yours. This recognition creates what Jung identified as the night sea journey, a period where your ego's previous organizing principles completely dissolve before new, authentic ones can emerge. During this transitional phase, you may feel like you're floating in psychological space with no clear direction because your internal compass is recalibrating from external reference points to internal truth. This developmental pattern sets up what researchers call post-conventional adjustment disorder, a temporary inability to find motivation in conventional reward systems after transcending the social contracts that once provided meaning. Number 3. The relational pattern, projective identification, withdrawal. Otto Kernberg's framework explores exactly why your motivational changes trigger such intense reactions in others. What you're experiencing isn't just personal transformation, it's the withdrawal from what Klein called projective identification relationships. For years, people around you unconsciously projected their disowned motivations, their unlived dreams, their suppressed authenticity onto you. You became their motivated one, their spiritual seeker, their high achiever. Your drive wasn't just personal, it was carrying collective shadow material for your entire relational network. Your awakening caused you to withdraw these projections. Suddenly, family members, friends, colleagues are left holding their own disowned motivation, their own spiritual bypassing, their own performance anxiety. They experience your motivational changes as abandonment because they were using your energy to avoid facing their own psychological work. You're not imagining the intensity of their reactions. There's a reason it feels so extreme. When you stop carrying other people's projected ambitions, they're forced to confront the emptiness in their own motivational systems. Your lack of motivation becomes a mirror for their lack of authentic purpose, and most people will fight desperately to avoid that reflection. Kernberg identified this as splitting behavior. Others will alternate between idealizing your previous motivated self and devaluing your current authentic state because they cannot integrate the complexity of genuine psychological transformation. And this is where the most fascinating discovery comes in. Your motivational collapse is actually evidence of what researchers call epistemic awakening. Number 4. The consciousness shift, epistemic trust revolution. Peter Fonagy's framework reveals the final piece. Your motivation didn't disappear, it evolved beyond recognition. What you're experiencing is epistemic awakening. Your capacity to trust knowledge has become radically more sophisticated. You can no longer generate energy for activities based on social proof, external authority, or conventional wisdom because your epistemic trust system now requires authentic resonance. This is mentalization at its highest level. You've developed what researchers call reflective functioning, that can distinguish between authentic motivation and socially conditioned drive. Most people cannot make this distinction, so they interpret your selectivity as laziness, your discernment as depression, your authenticity as dysfunction. Your consciousness has upgraded its operating system. Where you once found motivation through external validation loops, you now require what Jung called symbolic attitude, engagement with life that honors both conscious intention and unconscious wisdom. This creates a temporary void period where old motivations have died but new ones haven't fully crystallized. Once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. Every motivation you once trusted reveals itself as either authentic calling or conditioned performance. This level of psychological clarity is simultaneously liberating and paralyzing because it eliminates most of the easy energy sources that keep people moving through life unconsciously. The paradigm shift section. What you thought was losing your spiritual motivation is actually discovering that most of what you called spiritual was psychological bypassing dressed in sacred language. The reason your awakening feels so demotivating isn't spiritual failure. It's the collapse of what researchers call spiritual materialism, where you unconsciously use spiritual practice as another performance system to maintain false self-structure. You're not becoming less spiritual. You're discovering that authentic spirituality doesn't generate motivation in ways the ego recognizes. True spiritual development operates through what Jung called active imagination and what modern researchers identify as flow states. Motivation emerges spontaneously from present-moment alignment rather than future-focused achievement drive. The problem was never your lack of motivation. It was your attachment to motivation systems that required you to abandon present-moment awareness for future-focused striving. Your awakening dissolved your capacity for spiritual bypassing, leaving you temporarily without the familiar energy sources that most people mistake for genuine spiritual practice. The Liberation Permission section. If you have ever been accused of becoming lazy after your spiritual awakening, for simply refusing to generate artificial enthusiasm for activities that drain your authentic self, your selective engagement is not avoidance, it is wisdom. The truth is that most people cannot tolerate others operating from authentic motivation because it highlights the inauthenticity of their own drive systems. That pressure you feel to get motivated again is not spiritual guidance. It was manufactured from other people's discomfort with your authenticity. You have the right to exist in this transitional space without justifying your apparent lack of conventional motivation. This choice requires the specific courage to disappoint people who need you to remain trapped in performance-based spirituality for their own psychological comfort. When you choose to honor this motivational void as sacred space rather than pathology, you discover what Jung called the transcendent function, motivation that emerges from the integration of conscious and unconscious wisdom rather than ego-driven achievement. If you have ever felt guilty for no longer finding energy for spiritual practices that once excited you, your boredom is not spiritual regression. It is psychological sophistication. The truth is that most spiritual practices are designed for pre-awakening consciousness and become obsolete once authentic integration occurs. That guilt you feel for abandoning familiar spiritual routines is not divine punishment. It was manufactured from communities that mistake spiritual activity for spiritual development. You have the right to outgrow spiritual practices that no longer serve your evolutionary edge. This choice requires the specific courage to appear less spiritual to people who equate spiritual busyness with spiritual progress. When you choose to trust your authentic disinterest over social spiritual pressure, you discover what researchers call post-conventional spiritual development. Engagement with the sacred that emerges from being rather than doing. If you have ever realized that your spiritual motivation was actually spiritual performance designed to maintain an identity that others could understand, you are not losing your path, you are finding it. The truth is that authentic spirituality often looks like doing nothing to minds trained to recognize only performance-based devotion. That confusion you feel about what you're supposed to be doing spiritually is not spiritual confusion. It was manufactured from traditions that mistake activity for attainment. You didn't come into this incarnation to function as anyone's example of proper spiritual behavior. You have the right to embody spirituality in ways that make no sense to conventional religious or New Age frameworks. The spiritual communities that cannot support your authentic motivational patterns were never your true spiritual family. They were performance-based social groups using spiritual language to maintain familiar psychological contracts. The resistance acknowledgement section. Many will turn back here. They'll feel guilt about abandoning spiritual practices that once provided identity and community. They'll allow themselves to be captured by the fear that without conventional spiritual motivation, they'll lose their connection to the divine. You might doubt yourself. You might wonder if you're using awakening as an excuse for spiritual laziness, if you're being too selective about where you invest your energy, if you're disappointing teachers or communities who supported your previous spiritual identity. This choice requires not only strength to trust your authentic motivational patterns, but resilience not to return to spiritual performance when others pressure you with guilt about losing your spiritual discipline or becoming too comfortable. Most give up. They backtrack into familiar spiritual practices that no longer serve them. They negotiate their authentic disinterest for the superficial peace of meeting others' expectations about proper spiritual behavior. The people who will challenge your motivational changes most intensely are often those who were living vicariously through your spiritual performance. Your refusal to maintain artificial spiritual enthusiasm forces them to confront their own relationship with authentic practice versus spiritual identity management. Your family, spiritual community, even teachers may interpret your motivational selectivity as spiritual regression because they cannot distinguish between authentic integration and spiritual bypassing. They've been trained to recognize only performance-based devotion as real spirituality. The Identity Declaration Engagement. If this psychological framework illuminated something for you, if you recognized yourself in this pattern of post-awakening motivational collapse, declare, "I trust my authentic rhythm," in the comments. If you're ready to stop forcing spiritual motivation that no longer serves your evolutionary edge, write, "I honor my sacred emptiness." If you're done performing spiritual enthusiasm for others' comfort while feeling internally disconnected from practices that once inspired you, declare, "I choose authentic being over spiritual doing." This declaration is not for your spiritual community. It's for the part of you that still feels guilty for outgrowing spiritual practices that others consider essential. Say this to yourself. Declare this decision not to the spiritual world, but to the part of you that still fears you're losing your spirituality by trusting your authentic motivational patterns. If you're ready to embody post-conventional spirituality that emerges from being rather than doing, write, "I am enough without spiritual performance." If you've realized that your apparent lack of spiritual motivation is actually sophisticated spiritual discernment, declare, "I trust my awakened selectivity." Jung's hidden teaching, the transcendent function. Carl Jung discovered something about post-awakening motivation that most spiritual teachers never discuss. The transcendent function operates through what appears to be complete motivational breakdown. Jung observed that individuals experiencing authentic psychological integration go through extended periods where they cannot access familiar drive systems because their psyche is literally reconstructing its motivational architecture. What Jung called the transcendent function isn't a mystical concept. It's a precise psychological mechanism where your unconscious wisdom begins directing your life choices instead of your ego's achievement drive. This creates temporary motivational paralysis because you can no longer force energy for activities that don't align with your unconscious developmental needs. Jung identified this as active imagination in practice. Your life begins organizing itself through symbolic rather than literal engagement. What looks like lack of motivation is actually your psyche refusing to invest energy in anything that doesn't serve your individuation process. This is why conventional goal setting and motivation techniques stop working after awakening. They're designed for ego consciousness, not integrated awareness. According to Jung's research, individuals in this phase often experience what he termed the night sea journey, a period of apparent psychological death where old motivational patterns dissolve completely before new ones can emerge. This isn't spiritual depression, it's the natural process of psychological rebirth that requires complete surrender of previous drive systems. Jung discovered that trying to force motivation during this phase actually prolongs the transition because it reinvests energy in ego-based systems that need to dissolve. The transcendent function operates through what he called letting be, allowing your unconscious wisdom to gradually reveal authentic motivational patterns that serve your soul's development rather than your social identity's maintenance. The neurobiology of motivational death and rebirth. Recent research in neuroplasticity reveals exactly what happens in your brain during post-awakening motivational collapse. Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris's studies on psychedelic-induced ego dissolution show similar patterns. The default mode network, your brain's self-referential processing system, temporarily shuts down, eliminating the neural pathways that generated previous motivational patterns. This creates what researchers call cognitive flexibility enhancement. Your brain becomes capable of forming entirely new motivational neural networks, but the process requires temporary disconnection from familiar reward systems. What you experience as lack of motivation is actually neurobiological renovation at the deepest level. Dr. Judson Brewer's research on meditation and motivation reveals why this feels so uncomfortable. Your brain's reward prediction system, accustomed to generating dopamine from external achievements and social validation, begins recognizing only authentic satisfaction signals. This creates temporary anhedonia, inability to feel pleasure from previously rewarding activities while your nervous system recalibrates. Studies on flow state consciousness show that post-awakening individuals often develop what researchers call intrinsic motivation dependency. They become unable to generate sustained energy for activities that don't provide authentic engagement. This isn't spiritual laziness, it's neurobiological sophistication that eliminates psychological energy waste. The research reveals that this motivational reconstruction process typically takes 6 to 18 months for full integration, during which attempts to force previous motivation patterns actually interfere with the neurobiological rewiring necessary for authentic drive systems to emerge. The collective shadow projection, why others fear your motivational changes. Otto Kernberg's research reveals the deeper reason why your post-awakening motivational changes trigger such intense social reactions. You were unconsciously carrying projected motivation for your entire relational network. What appears as personal laziness is actually withdrawal from collective psychological labor that was never yours to perform. Kernberg identified this as pathological organizations in group psychology. Families, communities, and social systems unconsciously designate certain individuals to carry their disowned motivational energy. Your spiritual seeking, your achievement drive, your constant self-improvement became a repository for everyone else's unlived spiritual ambitions. Your awakening caused you to withdraw these projections, leaving others confronting their own motivational emptiness for the first time. The intensity of their reactions correlates directly with how much of their own authentic purpose they had projected onto your spiritual performance. This explains why family members, friends, and spiritual communities often become more invested in your motivation than you are. They're not concerned about your well-being. They're panicking about losing their external source of vicarious spiritual achievement. Your motivational collapse forces them to face their own relationship with authentic purpose versus spiritual bypassing. Kernberg's framework reveals that the people who pressure you most intensely to get motivated again are usually those with the most severe motivational authenticity deficits. They cannot tolerate your authentic selectivity because it mirrors their own disconnection from genuine purpose. The sacred economics of authentic motivation. Your post-awakening motivational collapse is actually evidence of what sacred economy researchers call gift culture consciousness emerging. Conventional motivation operates through scarcity-based exchange. You generate energy for activities that promise future rewards, security, or social positioning. Authentic motivation operates through abundance-based contribution. Energy emerges spontaneously when activities serve collective well-being and personal authenticity simultaneously. This creates apparent laziness in market economy contexts because gift culture motivation doesn't respond to artificial incentives, competition, or external pressure. Your psyche has upgraded to post-capitalist consciousness while existing in pre-awakened economic systems, creating motivational incompatibility that others interpret as dysfunction. Sacred economics reveals that authentic motivation emerges from what researchers call gift recognition, understanding your unique contribution to collective evolution. This recognition cannot be forced through conventional goal-setting or self-improvement techniques because it emerges from soul-level awareness rather than personality-level ambition. Your motivational void is actually sacred space where gift culture consciousness is developing. The pressure you feel to get motivated comes from market economy conditioning that mistakes authentic contribution for personal achievement, service for self-improvement, calling for career. The spiritual materialism collapse. What most people call spiritual motivation is actually what Chogyam Trungpa identified as spiritual materialism, using spiritual practice to enhance ego identity rather than dissolve it. Your post-awakening motivational collapse indicates that you've outgrown spiritual materialism but haven't yet discovered post-ego spiritual engagement. Trungpa's framework reveals why this feels so disorienting. Spiritual materialism provides clear motivation through achievement-based practices, meditation streaks, spiritual insights, energy work progress, consciousness expansion goals. When these motivational systems dissolve, you're left in what he called basic wakefulness, awareness without agenda. This explains why you can no longer generate enthusiasm for spiritual practices that once excited you. Your consciousness has evolved beyond needing spiritual experiences for identity reinforcement, but you haven't yet discovered what authentic spiritual engagement looks like without ego enhancement motivation. Trungpa identified this transition as necessary spiritual development, moving from seeking mind to being mind. Seeking mind generates motivation through spiritual acquisition, knowledge, experiences, states, abilities. Being mind operates through what he called just sitting, presence without purpose beyond presence itself. Your apparent spiritual laziness is actually sophisticated spiritual discrimination. You've developed what Trungpa called crazy wisdom, the ability to distinguish between authentic spiritual engagement and spiritual performance, even when that discrimination leaves you temporarily without familiar spiritual activities. The individuation crisis, Jung's map through motivational void. Carl Jung's concept of individuation provides the most accurate map for navigating post-awakening motivational collapse. According to Jung, individuation requires what he called psychological death, the complete dissolution of personality structures that maintained social adaptation but prevented authentic selfhood. This process typically manifests as motivational crisis because the activities that once provided energy, career advancement, relationship maintenance, spiritual achievement, social contribution, were serving persona development rather than authentic self-expression. Your awakening dissolved the persona, leaving you temporarily without the motivational systems that persona consciousness required. Jung identified this as confrontation with the unconscious, a phase where your ego's organizing principles completely dissolve before unconscious wisdom can provide new life direction. During this transition, conventional motivation techniques fail because they're designed for ego consciousness, not individuation consciousness. The key insight from Jung's work: you cannot force individuation-based motivation through willpower or positive thinking. Authentic purpose emerges through what he called active imagination, conscious cooperation with unconscious processes that reveal your unique contribution to collective consciousness evolution. Jung discovered that individuals attempting to rush through this motivational void by forcing previous drive systems actually delay individuation because they reinvest energy in persona maintenance rather than authentic self-development. The transcendent function operates through patience with psychological death and rebirth timing. The permission. You've been waiting for you have the right to exist in this motivational void without fixing it, explaining it, or apologizing for it. This transitional space is not pathology. It is sacred psychological territory where authentic purpose is gestating beyond ego recognition. You didn't come into this incarnation to maintain motivation systems that serve collective psychological comfort while depleting your authentic vitality. The guilt you feel about disappointing others with your apparent lack of drive is manufactured from systems that mistake psychological compliance for spiritual development. You have the right to disappoint people who need you to remain motivated in ways that serve their projections rather than your authentic development. This choice requires specific courage to appear less together to individuals who are living vicariously through your previous motivational performance. The spiritual communities, family systems, and social networks that cannot support your authentic motivational patterns were never your true spiritual family. They were performance-based social contracts using spiritual or personal development language to maintain familiar psychological exchange patterns. You have the right to trust that authentic motivation will emerge from soul alignment rather than social pressure. This trust requires releasing the safety of familiar drive systems for the uncertainty of consciousness, directed engagement with life's evolutionary requirements. The revolutionary reframe: motivation as consciousness, evolution. What you thought was losing motivation after spiritual awakening is actually developing what researchers call consciousness-responsive engagement, the ability to invest energy only in activities that serve both personal authenticity and collective evolution simultaneously. The reason your awakening feels so demotivating isn't spiritual failure. It's the development of what Jung called ethical consciousness that cannot generate energy for activities requiring self-abandonment, even when those activities appear spiritual, productive, or socially valuable. You're not becoming less capable. You're developing what advanced consciousness researchers identify as integrated intelligence. Engagement with life that honors intuitive wisdom, emotional authenticity, mental clarity, and physical vitality simultaneously. This integration eliminates most conventional motivation sources because they require compartmentalization of consciousness. The problem was never your lack of motivation, it was your attachment to motivation systems designed for pre-awakening consciousness, operating through separation, competition, and external validation, rather than integration, collaboration, and internal resonance. The circular resolution, returning to your story. Remember that moment when you simply chose authenticity over performance and your entire motivational system collapsed. What Jung's framework reveals is that this collapse was not failure. It was graduation from motivation systems that required psychological fragmentation to function. Your refusal to force enthusiasm for activities that no longer serve your authentic development isn't spiritual laziness. It's consciousness evolution, recognizing that true service emerges from being rather than doing, presence rather than performance, authenticity rather than social adaptation. The psychological framework explains exactly why this triggers such extreme reactions in others. Your motivational selectivity forces everyone around you to confront their own relationship with authentic purpose versus socially conditioned drive. Your apparent lack of motivation becomes a mirror for their disconnection from genuine calling. The liberation path forward isn't recovering previous motivation. It's trusting that consciousness-directed engagement will emerge from soul alignment rather than ego effort. This requires patience with the sacred void, where authentic purpose is developing beyond personality-level recognition. If you felt that tightness in your chest, recognizing a story that is or was yours, then write in the comments, "I trust the sacred void," and know that your motivational collapse is evidence of consciousness evolution, not spiritual regression. Final declaration: the identity you're becoming. You are not the person who forces motivation for activities that drain authentic vitality while maintaining social approval. You are becoming the person who invests energy only in engagement that serves both soul development and collective consciousness evolution. You are not the person who performs spiritual enthusiasm to maintain identity and community while feeling internally disconnected from practices that no longer serve evolutionary edge. You are becoming the person who embodies post-conventional spirituality that emerges from being rather than doing. You are not the person who carries projected motivation for others while depleting personal authentic vitality to maintain relational comfort. You are becoming the person who returns all projected ambitions to their rightful owners while trusting that authentic contribution emerges from soul alignment rather than social pressure. This identity transformation requires not only strength to trust consciousness-directed engagement, but resilience not to return to performance-based motivation when others pressure you with guilt about losing your drive or becoming too comfortable. Your motivational collapse after spiritual awakening is not evidence of spiritual failure. It is evidence of consciousness graduation from systems that required self-abandonment to function. You are not losing your path. You are finding it through the courage to trust that authentic purpose emerges from soul wisdom rather than social conditioning. The transcendent function operates through apparent inactivity that others mistake for dysfunction, but is actually consciousness evolution occurring beyond personality-level recognition. Your willingness to exist in this sacred void without forcing familiar motivational patterns is evidence of spiritual sophistication that most never develop. You have chosen consciousness over comfort, authenticity over approval, soul alignment over social adaptation. This choice transforms not only your motivational patterns, but your entire relationship with purpose, service, and contribution to collective consciousness evolution. If you're ready to declare this identity transformation, write, "I am consciousness evolving," and trust that your motivational void is sacred space where authentic purpose is developing beyond ego recognition into soul-directed engagement with life's evolutionary requirements.